Adrian has always been my anchor. My twin, my other half, the only person who truly understands me. But now, every glance lingers too long. Every touch burns too hot, and I can't ignore the fire growing between us. One night, everything changed. His whispered words, his deliberate touch, it was like crossing a line we could never return from. Now, we're walking a razor's edge, caught between the bond we've always had and the heat that threatens to consume us. How do you hold on to the one person you can't live without when the world would never understand? Before we dive into this powerful story, let us know where you're tuning in from, and if you find it compelling, don't forget to hit subscribe. I've always known Adrian and I were different from other siblings. From the very beginning, there was something about our connection that couldn't be explained. We weren't just twins. We were a single unit born just 3 minutes apart, and it felt like those 3 minutes didn't matter at all. When we were kids, our lives revolved around each other. Wherever Adrian went, I followed, and wherever I led, he was there to back me up. We had this private language, half whispers, half gestures, that only we understood. Teachers at school used to joke about how we didn't even need words to communicate. 2 bodies, 1 mind, one of them said once. That description stuck with me because, deep down, it felt true. I remember the days when Adrian would scrape his knee playing soccer, and somehow, I'd feel it too. A phantom ache that would linger long after his had faded. Or how, when I'd feel sick, he'd get quiet, like the energy drained out of him just because it did for me. It wasn't something we questioned, it was just how we were. We'd spend endless afternoons together, lying under the sun, coming up with grand plans for the future. We used to talk about becoming adventurers, traveling the world side by side, or building a treehouse empire in the backyard. No matter how absurd the dream, it was always about us, together. Our parents noticed, of course. "You two are inseparable," Mom would say with a laugh, ruffling Adrian's hair. Dad would tell us to branch out more, to make other friends. But why would we, when it felt like no one else understood us the way we understood each other? Even now, thinking back, I can still see those days in sharp detail. The way Adrian's laughter lit up a room, or how his voice, even in its softness, carried a strength that made me feel like nothing in the world could hurt us. But things don't stay simple forever. The bond that once seemed like the most natural thing in the world began to feel heavier, more complicated. I didn't understand it then, but looking back now, I can see the cracks beginning to form. Our connection wasn't just unique, it was a weight we carried. And for the first time, I began to wonder if it would carry us, or if we'd end up crushed under it. Adrian and I had always been mirrors of each other, but as we got older, something in that reflection began to shift. It wasn't a sudden thing. It came on slowly, like the way leaves change color in the fall. You don't notice it at first, but then one day, everything feels different. It started around the time we turned 16. Adrian had always been the more outgoing of the two of us. He was the kind of person who could light up a room with just a smile, effortlessly charming everyone in sight. I was quieter, content to let him take the lead. But lately, I found myself watching him in a way that left me unsettled. There was nothing obvious about it, just little things. How his laughter lingered in the air, or how his eyes would crinkle when he smiled, like he was letting you in on a secret. I caught myself staring too long sometimes, feeling a warmth creep up my neck when he'd catch me. At first, I chalked it up to admiration. Adrian had always been everything I wasn't. Bold, confident, magnetic. But that explanation felt thin, like an excuse I was trying too hard to believe. Adrian noticed. Of course, he always noticed. "Luca," he said one day after school, his voice teasing. "You've been weird lately. What's up?" "Nothing," I replied too quickly, turning away to hide the flush in my cheeks. He didn't push, but I could feel his eyes on me, sharp and searching. Adrian had a way of reading me that was both comforting and unnerving, like he could see every thought I was trying to bury. The shifts weren't just on my side, though. Adrian started acting differently, too. He'd brush against me when there was plenty of room to pass, or sit a little closer than he needed to. I told myself it was nothing, just the way we'd always been. But the air between us felt different now, charged with something unspoken. Late at night, lying in the dark, I'd replay those moments in my head, trying to make sense of them. Was it all in my imagination, or was Adrian feeling it too? For the first time in our lives, the bond we shared wasn't comforting. It was confusing, and it scared me because I didn't know what it meant or where it was taking us. The house was quiet that evening, bathed in the soft glow of a fading sunset. Adrian and I sat on the worn couch in the living room, a half-forgotten movie playing on the screen. The silence between us wasn't unusual. We'd always been comfortable without needing to fill the space with words. But tonight, the silence felt different. Heavy. Adrian leaned back, one arm draped casually along the top of the couch. His fingers tapped against the fabric in an unsteady rhythm. I could feel him looking at me, though I kept my eyes fixed on the screen. "Luca," he said softly, his voice breaking the stillness. "Yeah." I didn't look at him, afraid of what I might see in his expression. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." My heart began to race, though I couldn't say why. He hesitated, his fingers pausing mid-tap. "Do you ever feel like maybe what we have isn't normal?" I turned to face him then, his words cutting through the air like a blade. "What do you mean?" Adrian's gaze was steady, but there was a vulnerability in his eyes I'd never seen before. "I mean, the way we are, how close we are. Do you think other people feel this way about their siblings?" My chest tightened, and for a moment, I couldn't speak. The question felt like stepping off a cliff, the ground falling away beneath me. I don't know," I stammered, turning away again. "I've never thought about it." That was a lie, of course. I thought about it plenty. Lately, felt like it was all I could think about. But admitting that to Adrian was impossible. He didn't push me, but I could feel his disappointment in the way his arms slipped down from the couch, his posture folding inward. The silence that followed was unbearable. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to make it weird." "It's not weird," I said quickly, though my own heart was hammering in my chest. "It's just, I don't know how to answer that." He nodded, a small, tight movement. "Yeah, me neither." The movie played on, but neither of us was watching it anymore. My mind raced, replaying his words, searching for meaning in them. Did he feel it too, the unspoken tension, the confusion that had been gnawing at me for weeks? Or was this just his way of trying to understand something I couldn't even name? I wanted to say something, to bridge the gap that had suddenly opened between us, but the words wouldn't come. So, I stayed quiet, letting the moments slip through my fingers. Later that night, lying in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about his question. It hung in the air like a shadow, too big to ignore but too terrifying to face. And for the first time, I wondered if our bond, the one thing that had always made sense, was about to unravel. After that night, everything between Adrian and me felt different, though neither of us spoke about it again. His question hung between us like an invisible thread, pulling tight whenever we were near each other. At first, I thought I could pretend it never happened, but that was easier said than done. The little moments we used to share so easily, quiet laughter, casual touches, shared glances, now felt charged with something I didn't understand. One afternoon, Adrian and I were in the kitchen, making sandwiches like we'd done 1,000 times before. He stood beside me at the counter, his shoulder brushing mine as he reached for the bread. It was such a small thing, but the warmth of his skin against mine sent a shiver down my spine. I froze, hoping he didn't notice. "Hey," he said, his voice soft, almost tentative. "You okay?" "Yeah," I replied too quickly, avoiding his gaze. Why wouldn't I be? He didn't answer, but I felt his eyes lingering on me. The air between us felt heavier than it should have, like the room was holding its breath. That tension followed us everywhere. Sitting on the couch, I'd catch him watching me out of the corner of his eye, his expression unreadable. When we passed each other in the hallway, our fingers would brush, and I'd feel an electric jolt that left me rattled for hours. At night, lying in the dark, I replayed those moments over and over, trying to make sense of them. Was it all in my head? Or did Adrian feel it too? One night, I heard his door creak open. I lay still, my heart pounding, as his footsteps approached. He paused outside my room, and for a moment, I thought he was going to come in. But then he turned away, and the sound of his retreating steps left me staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. It wasn't just me struggling. Adrian was quieter these days, his usual confidence replaced by something more subdued. He'd start to say something, then stop, his words catching in his throat. Once, I caught him staring at me while I was reading. When I looked up, he quickly turned away, his cheeks faintly red. "Adrian," I said cautiously. "What's going on?" "Nothing," he said, his voice tight. Why would anything be going on? I wanted to push him, to force him to talk. But I didn't. How could I, when I was just as lost as he was? The unspoken tension between us was like a storm building on the horizon. Inevitable, unstoppable. And deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time before it broke. The storm finally broke one night when the house was ours alone. Our parents had gone out for dinner, leaving Adrian and me to our own devices. Normally, we'd have spent the evening watching movies or playing games, the house filled with easy laughter. But tonight wasn't normal. It hadn't been for weeks. Adrian was in the living room when I found him, sprawled on the couch with a book in his hands. He wasn't reading, though. His eyes were distant, staring at the same page as if waiting for it to change. "Hey!" I said softly, sitting down on the opposite end of the couch. "Hey!" he replied, his voice lacking its usual energy. For a few minutes we sat in silence, the only sound the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. The tension was unbearable, pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't escape. "Luca," Adrian said suddenly, breaking the silence. I looked at him, my heart pounding. His eyes met mine, and for the first time I saw raw vulnerability there. "Why have you been avoiding me?" he asked. "I'm not," I started, but he cut me off. "Yes, you are," he said, his voice firm but tinged with hurt. "Ever since that night, you've been distant. You barely talk to me anymore. What's going on?" I opened my mouth to deny it again, but the words caught in my throat. Because he was right. I had been avoiding him. "I don't know," I said finally, my voice barely a whisper. I don't know how to act around you anymore." "Why?" Adrian pressed, leaning forward. "What's changed?" I couldn't look at him. "You know what's changed," I said, my voice shaking. "Ever since you asked that question, I can't stop thinking about it. About us. About what it means." Adrian was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was soft. "Do you think about it all the time?" "Because I do." My head snapped up, and I stared at him in shock. "What?" "I can't stop thinking about it either," he admitted, his hands gripping the edge of the couch. "About how we feel. About how I feel." The room seemed to shrink around us, the air thick with emotions I couldn't name. "What are you saying?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Adrian looked at me, his gaze steady despite the vulnerability in his expression. "I'm saying that whatever this is, you're not alone in it." Couldn't breathe. His words hit me like a tidal wave, validating every fear and hope I'd been too scared to face. "I don't know what to do," I said finally, my voice breaking. "We'll figure it out," Adrian said, his voice firm. "Together. We always do." In that moment, the storm raging between us seemed to quiet, leaving only the fragile truth we could no longer ignore. The silence that followed Adrian's words was suffocating, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator in the next room. My mind raced, trying to process what he'd said, but it felt like the ground had been pulled out from under me. "Together," I repeated, the word foreign on my tongue. "How? How do we even begin to figure this out?" Adrian shifted closer on the couch, and though he didn't touch me, I could feel the heat of his presence. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice soft but steady. "But I know we can't keep pretending this isn't happening. I'm tired of ignoring it. Ignoring it. That's exactly what I'd been trying to do for weeks, pushing down the feelings that surfaced whenever he was near. And yet, hearing him say it, acknowledging the very thing I couldn't bring myself to, felt like a strange sort of relief. He hesitated, then added, "You don't have to feel the same way. If this is just me." "Adrian," I interrupted, my voice trembling. "It's not just you." The weight of my admission hung in the air, and for the first time in weeks, the tension between us didn't feel suffocating. Felt freeing. Adrian's lips parted slightly, his eyes searching mine. "Then why are we so scared?" "Because it was terrifying, wasn't it? To admit that the bond we'd always cherished had changed. That it was no longer just about being brothers but something far more complicated." "I don't know," I whispered. "Maybe because once we admit it, there's no going back." He nodded slowly, his gaze dropping to his hands. "Yeah, but maybe that's not such a bad thing." Before I could respond, his foot brushed against mine, a light, almost accidental touch. It was nothing, just a simple, casual contact, but it felt like a spark, igniting something deep inside me. My breath hitched, and when I looked up, Adrian's eyes were locked on mine. He didn't pull away, didn't say a word, and in that moment, everything we'd been avoiding was laid bare. I didn't move, couldn't move. As his hand drifted toward mine, his fingers just barely grazing my own. The touch was tentative, hesitant, but it sent a jolt through me all the same. "We'll figure it out," he said again, his voice firm. "Together." And for the first time, I let myself believe him. The hours after Adrian's words passed in a haze. We moved through the rest of the evening as if nothing had changed, but everything had. The air between us buzzed with unspoken truths, a fragile balance that felt ready to shatter at the slightest touch. It was late when I finally decided to go to bed. I lingered in the doorway of my room, glancing back toward the living room where Adrian was still sitting, his head resting against the back of the couch. His eyes were closed, and for a moment I thought he'd fallen asleep. But then he spoke, his voice soft and low. "Luca." I froze. "Yeah." He opened his eyes, turning to look at me. There was something in his expression, an openness, a vulnerability that sent a shiver down my spine. "Come here," he said, his tone gentle but insistent. I hesitated for a moment before stepping back into the room. The space between us felt impossibly large, though it was only a few steps. When I reached the couch, Adrian shifted, making room for me to sit beside him. For a while, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched, heavy with tension, but neither of us seemed willing to break it. Finally, Adrian leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped together. "I keep thinking," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "If I don't say this now, I might never say it." "Say what?" I asked, my heart pounding. He turned to face me, his eyes meeting mine. "That I feel something for you, something I don't know how to explain, but it's there. And I think you feel it too." I didn't trust myself to speak, so I nodded instead. Adrian's hand moved, brushing against mine, and I didn't pull away. The touch was tentative, almost questioning, but it sent a jolt of electricity through me. And then, before I could think too much, he leaned in. His lips met mine in a soft, tentative kiss, barely more than a whisper of contact. It was over in an instant, but it left me breathless, my mind spinning. When he pulled back, his eyes searched mine. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice trembling. "I think so," I managed, my voice barely audible. I didn't know it would feel like that." "Like what?" "Like everything." Adrian smiled, a small, uncertain thing, but it was enough to steady the ground beneath us. For the first time, the barriers we'd built between us were gone. And though the road ahead was still uncertain, I knew one thing for sure: we weren't turning back. The days after that first kiss were a whirlwind of emotions. Every moment with Adrian felt sharper, more vivid but also more complicated. The world hadn't changed, our parents were still the same, our house just as familiar, but we had Neither of us spoke about what had happened, not directly. There were no grand declarations or plans for what came next. But something unspoken lingered between us, shaping every glance, every word. Adrian acted like nothing had changed when we were around others. At dinner, he laughed at Dad's jokes and teased Mom about her cooking. But under the table, his knee brushed against mine, lingering just a little too long. I couldn't stop thinking about that kiss. It replayed in my mind every night when I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The way his lips felt, the quiet intensity in his eyes afterward. It was all too much, yet not enough. But with those thoughts came the fear. What if someone found out? What if we couldn't keep this thing between us contained? Do you think they know? I asked one night as we sat in the backyard, the darkness wrapping around us like a blanket. Who? Adrian said, his voice low. Mom and Dad. Anyone. He shook his head. No. Why would they? I don't know, I admitted. I feel like I'm walking around with this neon sign over my head. Like everyone can see what's going on inside me. Adrian turned to me, his expression serious. They don't know, he said firmly. And they won't. This is just ours. The way he said it, ours, sent a shiver through me. I wanted to believe him, but the weight of what we were doing felt impossible to carry. Adrian must have sensed my hesitation because he reached out, his hand brushing mine. Hey, he said softly, we'll figure this out. Okay? Together. Like always. I nodded, but the knot in my chest didn't loosen. Keeping this secret made every stolen moment feel precious, but it also made every step feel like we were walking on a tightrope, one wrong move away from disaster. And the scariest part? I wasn't sure if I wanted to keep my balance, or if I wanted to fall. Life didn't stop for us. Couldn't. There were still chores to do, classes to attend, and meals to share with our parents. But beneath the surface of our carefully maintained routines, everything had changed. Adrian and I fell into an unspoken rhythm. Around others, we were the same as we'd always been, playful, teasing, and inseparable. But in private, the lines we'd crossed lingered, shaping our every interaction. One afternoon, we were sitting in the living room, our parents out for the day. The television was on, but neither of us was watching. Adrian sat beside me, closer than he needed to, his knee brushing mine. It's weird, isn't it? I said, breaking the silence. What is this? Pretending like nothing's different when everything is. Adrian smiled, a soft, lopsided grin that made my chest tighten. I guess. But isn't that what we've always done? We've been pretending to be normal our whole lives. I wanted to argue, but I couldn't. He was right. We'd always been different, always been closer than people thought we should be. This was just the next step, wasn't it? Still, the secrecy gnawed at me. Every time I caught a glimpse of us in the mirror or heard our parents call us by name, it reminded me of the precariousness of what we'd built. Do you ever feel guilty? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Adrian's smile faded. Sometimes, he admitted. Not because of how I feel about you, just because I know what people would think, what they'd say. His words hit me like a punch to the gut, but I nodded. I knew exactly what he meant. At school, I found myself hyper-aware of how I acted around Adrian. I didn't touch him as often, didn't linger near him in the hallways. It was exhausting, constantly trying to measure every glance, every word, every movement. But at home, behind closed doors, it was different. There, we could be us, even if only for stolen moments. Like when Adrian's hand found mine one night as we sat side by side in the dim glow of the TV. His thumb brushed against my knuckles, a small, reassuring gesture that made the tightrope we were walking feel a little steadier. I'm not going anywhere, he said softly, his voice barely audible over the background noise. And for now, that was enough. The inevitability of our situation loomed over us like a shadow. As much as Adrian and I tried to carve out a space just for us, the world outside that fragile bubble couldn't be ignored forever. It came to a head one evening when we were in our room, the door firmly shut against the rest of the house. Adrian was lying on my bed, staring up at the ceiling, while I sat at my desk, pretending to work on an assignment. Neither of us spoke, the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on the room like a physical force. "Do you ever think about what happens next?" I asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Adrian turned his head to look at me. "What do you mean?" "I mean this. How long can we keep this a secret?" My voice wavered, betraying the anxiety I'd been trying to keep at bay. Adrian sat up, his brow furrowed. "We've kept it secret this long." "That's not an answer." I turned to face him, my frustration bubbling to the surface. "What if someone finds out? What if we can't do this anymore?" He stood and crossed the room in a few quick strides, kneeling in front of me so we were eye to eye. "Luca," he said firmly, his hands gripping mine, "listen to me. No one's going to find out. And even if they do, it doesn't matter. You matter. To me, more than anything." I wanted to believe him, but the fear gnawed at me, relentless and unyielding. "It's not fair," I said, my voice cracking. "We didn't choose this." "No," Adrian agreed, his voice softening. "We didn't, but we do get to choose what we do with it." I searched his face, looking for any sign of doubt, but all I saw was determination. Adrian had always been like that, steady, unshakable, even when the world felt like it was crumbling around us. "I don't know if I can do this," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "You can," he said, squeezing my hands, "because we'll do it together, like always." For a moment, the fear eased, replaced by the quiet strength in Adrian's eyes. Whatever the future held, I knew we'd face it side by side. "Okay," I said finally, my voice steady. "Together." And for the first time in weeks, I felt like we might actually be okay. The morning sunlight streamed through the window, painting the room in soft, golden hues. I watched Adrian as he stood by the door, his hand lingering on the knob. For a moment, I thought he might say something, but he didn't. Instead, he turned back to look at me, his expression unreadable. "What?" I asked, the corner of my mouth twitching upward despite the weight in my chest. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Nothing. Just thinking." "About what?" He shrugged, but I could see the gears turning in his mind. "The future, I guess. What it's going to look like for us." I nodded, the familiar knot tightening in my stomach. The future was a question neither of us could answer, a road that stretched out before us, shrouded in uncertainty. But then Adrian stepped closer, his hand brushing mine as he passed. "Whatever happens," he said softly, his voice steady, "we'll figure it out. Together?" I whispered, the word a promise as much as a hope. He nodded, his gaze lingering on me for a moment before he left the room. And as the door clicked shut, I let myself believe, for just a little while, that we could.